Today, we are going to look at the Karens who met the most shocking ends, from a coffee shop confrontation that turned a simple beverage complaint into a deadly trap, to a scenic overlook where the pursuit of the perfect photo became a fatal miscalculation. It was July 19, 2018, in Tampa, Florida, a humid afternoon with heat shimmering off the pavement of a strip mall parking lot. The lunchtime rush was steady at a small cafe known for its drive-through coffee line that often wrapped around the building. Most customers waited patiently in the slow crawl of cars, but one driver stood out that day. 44-year-old Darlene Cooper, a part-time insurance clerk who came by a few times a week. Co-workers later said Darlene had a habit of recording minor confrontations on her phone, whether it was with store clerks, delivery drivers, or neighbors. That afternoon, she ordered a large hot coffee and a muffin from the cafe. When the drink was handed to her through the window, she lifted the cup, looked at the lid, and complained that it wasn't filled all the way. The worker apologized and offered to make a new one, but Darlene began raising her voice, drawing attention from other cars in line. Witnesses in nearby cars said she began shouting that she was being cheated out of her money. The cashier tried again to hand her a new cup, but Darlene tossed the one she'd been given through the open window. The coffee splashed across the counter and hit a young worker's arm. Security footage later showed staff stepping back in shock as Darlene drove forward a few feet, threw her SUV into park, and got out. She walked quickly toward the window, still holding her phone up in front of her. The video later recovered from that phone showed her yelling about poor service, demanding the worker's name, and pacing near the concrete post that marked the edge of the drive-through lane. The manager inside told her to leave, or he would call the police. Instead, she turned sharply and walked back toward her vehicle, muttering that she had evidence. Customers in line behind her recalled that she was still recording while pulling open the driver door. The air outside was thick, over 90 degrees, and the sound of idling engines mixed with her shouting. She set her phone on the dashboard mount, half inside the car, half standing outside. The door was still wide open. According to investigators who later reviewed the footage, what happened next lasted less than 5 seconds. Darlene swung her leg inside, trying to slam the door shut with her left hand while keeping her phone balanced on the dashboard mount. The engine was still running, and as she moved to sit back down, her foot pressed the accelerator instead of the brake. The SUV jerked forward with a short screech of tires. The open door hit the concrete post beside her parking space. The metal folded backward, trapping her between the door's inner edge and the car frame. The force crushed her upper chest against the steering column. The phone recording captured a burst of noise, then went still. A man 2 cars behind witnessed the entire impact. He said he first thought the vehicle had simply stalled, but when he saw Darlene's body pinned in the doorway, he jumped out of his car and ran toward her. The engine was still revving in gear, wheels spinning against the curb. He tried pulling the handle, but the twisted door was jammed against the post. Another driver shouted for someone to turn off the ignition. A woman reached through the passenger side to switch it off, but by then there was no movement from Darlene. The cafe staff locked the drive-through window and called emergency services, while the line of cars backed away to give space. Responders later said that the position of the SUV and the bent metal frame made extraction difficult. It took several minutes to pry the door loose enough to reach her paramedics, later noted severe chest trauma, consistent with high compression from the door hinge. Investigators pieced together the timeline mostly from her own phone. The video began with her ordering coffee and continued all the way through her shouting at staff, walking back to the SUV, and getting in. The final image froze on the steering wheel a split second before the sound of impact. Authorities classified the death as accidental, caused by blunt force injuries to the chest. They noted there was no evidence of mechanical failure, only driver error combined with distraction. Witnesses confirmed that the outburst over the half-filled cup lasted nearly 3 minutes before the fatal moment. By evening, the cafe reopened the lane. The bent post stayed for days while the video remained unreleased, though investigators confirmed it captured the full argument. The case was ruled an accidental death, a fatal mistake that turned an ordinary argument over coffee into a tragedy. It was March 22, 2019 in Sedona, Arizona, a bright, windy afternoon that drew steady weekend crowds to the Red Rock lookouts along State Route 89A. The Vista Point near Cathedral Rock was busy that afternoon, with tourists taking photos and families walking up the gravel trail leading to the elevated overlook. Among the visitors was 53-year-old Denise Harper, who had arrived with relatives in 2 cars after a long lunch downtown. Denise was a former receptionist who began using a small, 3-wheeled travel scooter after a knee injury she sustained during an argument at a shopping center several years earlier. According to family, she enjoyed visiting scenic areas and was confident operating the scooter on paved surfaces. That afternoon, she decided to follow her relatives partway up the viewing path, despite the posted sign restricting motorized vehicles beyond the parking lot. The trail itself was a narrow service road converted into a pedestrian path, climbing at a shallow angle before curving toward the overlook. Fine sandstone gravel lined the edges, and the drop-off on one side sloped several dozen feet down to a rocky basin. Visitors often paused midway to take pictures of the valley, leaning against the low wooden rail that served more as a marker than a barrier. Witnesses later told investigators that Denise appeared cheerful, but dismissive when others cautioned her about the trail's slope. A volunteer guide near the base reminded visitors that motorized scooters weren't recommended past the paved section, but Denise waved him off and continued upward. Family members said she insisted she knew what she was doing. The scooter's rear tires slipped occasionally on loose grit as she maneuvered around small rocks about halfway up. The incline steepened slightly. By 3:15 p.m., the family had reached a rest area just below the main overlook platform. Denise stopped a few yards behind them and took out her phone to take a panoramic photo. Witnesses nearby said she began adjusting her position to frame the background better, reversing slightly toward the open edge where the gravel thinned. Footage from another tourist's camera, later reviewed by investigators, showed the scooter's rear wheels spinning briefly before sliding over the worn edge of the trail. The combination of incline and loose rock caused the scooter to tilt backward. Denise instinctively leaned forward and turned the handlebars, but the shift in weight caused the left wheel to lift completely off the ground. Within seconds, the scooter tipped sideways and went over the slope. Several witnesses shouted as the chair rolled down the incline, striking rocks and brush before coming to rest roughly 20 feet below. Family members ran down the slope while others called 911. The fall had dislodged the scooter's seat and battery pack, both found a few feet away from where Denise lay motionless. Emergency crews from a local fire department arrived at 3:26 p.m. and used a rope line to access the area. Paramedics confirmed no signs of life at the scene. The county medical examiner later determined the cause of death as blunt force trauma to the head and upper torso, consistent with impact during a fall. Investigators from the sheriff's office documented tire marks leading from the main trail to the edge, confirming the scooter's loss of traction rather than intentional movement. The device's controls were found functioning normally, ruling out a mechanical malfunction. Authorities concluded that the fall was an accidental loss of control, compounded by unsuitable terrain. While the sign restricting motorized use was clearly visible at the trail entrance, no physical barrier prevented access. The overlook remained temporarily closed for safety assessment. Within a week, local officials installed reinforced fencing and additional signage warning visitors about unstable ground and prohibiting scooters, strollers, or wheeled equipment beyond the pavement. The family later told investigators they believed Denise had simply wanted a better view for her photo and underestimated how quickly the scooter could shift on loose rock. It was May 13, 2017, in Cedar Rapids, Iowa, a warm Saturday morning when the aisles of a local discount supermarket were packed with weekend shoppers. The steady hum of carts and checkout scanners filled the air. At Register 6, the line stretched nearly to the back of the produce section as people waited to pay for groceries and household items. Among them was Patricia Larkin, known by many in her neighborhood as Patty. She was 52, a retired librarian who lived alone on the east side of town. Former co-workers described her as outspoken, someone who never hesitated to correct others in public if she thought they were wrong. She came to the store regularly, often mid-morning on weekends when lines were longest. At around 10:40 a.m., surveillance footage later showed Patty pushing her cart past at least 5 customers in line at the self-checkout area. She positioned her cart directly behind another shopper who was placing items on the conveyor. A man in his 30s wearing a gray sweatshirt told her the end of the line was behind him. Witnesses said she looked straight at him and raised her voice, saying she didn't have time to deal with delays. Several people in line turned their heads as her voice carried through the checkout area. The man repeated himself, gesturing toward the line that extended behind the soda display. Instead of moving, Patty gripped her cart and pushed it forward, striking the back of the man's legs. The sound of metal wheels against the tile floor made several people step back. A store employee at the service counter began walking toward the commotion, but before he reached them, multiple shoppers had already started recording with their phones. The video later confirmed that the man did not retaliate. He stepped aside, raising his hands in disbelief, while Patty began unloading her groceries onto the belt. One of the witnesses, a woman near the express lane, told investigators that Patty seemed flustered and was muttering under her breath as she reached for items from her cart. Her movements were quick and jerky. Another customer, standing 2 registers away, said she complained that the store needed better trained staff. At that point, the manager on duty, identified later in reports as David Hall, approached from the customer service counter. He stood a few feet away and asked her to step aside to resolve the issue calmly. Patty turned, one hand still gripping her cart handle. Her body was angled halfway between the belt and the aisle divider. The surveillance footage captured what happened next. As she turned to respond, the front wheel of her shopping cart caught the edge of the metal guardrail that lined the base of the conveyor. When she tried to shift her foot, her right shoe slipped between the small gap near the rail. The cart tilted slightly, and she instinctively yanked her leg back to free herself. That movement caused her to lose balance. She stumbled backward, her arms flailing briefly before her body hit the floor. Her head struck the corner of a low-standing freezer that held packaged meat products near the checkout area. The impact produced a dull, heavy sound that was clearly audible on the store's security audio. Witnesses said the entire area went silent. A woman screamed for help, and several shoppers backed away, leaving their carts behind. The man she had argued with stood motionless, still holding his phone. The manager knelt beside Patty, who remained unresponsive. Another employee called 911 from the service counter while customers began clearing the surrounding lanes. Paramedics arrived within minutes, but emergency personnel later confirmed she had sustained a fatal skull fracture and brain hemorrhage from the impact. Security footage showed that the entire confrontation, from the moment she cut the line to the moment she fell, lasted less than 2 minutes. Store policy required a full shutdown of the affected checkout area, and customers were redirected to the remaining lanes. By 11:15 a.m., yellow tape surrounded registers 6 and 7, while police reviewed footage and took statements. Her cart remained across 2 lanes, half filled with groceries. Investigators ruled the death an accidental fall caused by imbalance and blunt force trauma. The store reopened that evening, adding padding to the freezer corner involved in the incident. It was September 10, 2016, in Plano, Texas, an early evening just after a passing thunderstorm. The rain had slowed to a drizzle, leaving shallow puddles across the wide parking lot of a suburban grocery complex. The wet asphalt reflected the glow of overhead lights and the red brake beams of shoppers pulling out with weekend groceries. Rhonda Ellis, 46, was a self-employed real estate agent who managed several rental properties in the area. Tenants and co-workers described her as assertive, often getting into minor arguments over parking, delivery access, or who had the right to certain spaces. Her silver crossover SUV was parked several rows from the store entrance as she waited for her husband to arrive in a second vehicle. Around 6:20 p.m., a blue sedan turned into the same aisle. Security footage later showed it slowing as it approached an open parking space only a few feet from where Rhonda was standing. As the driver angled to pull in, Rhonda stepped forward and stood in the middle of the space, motioning with her hands for the car to stop. The sedan paused, blinkers still on. The driver rolled down the window and said something, but the camera's audio didn't pick it up. Witnesses nearby later told police they heard Rhonda insisting that the space was meant for her husband, who was on his way. When the driver gave up and turned toward another row, she remained standing there for a few seconds with her arms crossed before walking back toward her SUV, shaking her head. Footage showed her pulling a set of car keys from her jacket pocket and tossing them down in frustration. The keys bounced once and landed beside a metal light pole base, where water had pooled from the earlier rain. She walked over to pick them up, unaware that the metal housing around the pole's base had been corroded for months. Maintenance records would later show that the wiring inside had been flagged for repair twice earlier that year, but never serviced. Moisture from the storm had seeped into the cracked seal, exposing a live wire that made intermittent contact with the metal casing whenever it was wet. Rhonda crouched beside the pole and reached down with her right hand. According to two shoppers across the aisle, there was a sudden blue-white flash, followed by a loud pop. Rhonda's body stiffened, and she let out a single sharp scream before collapsing sideways onto the wet ground. Her right hand was still gripping the key ring, which was partly submerged in the shallow puddle. A man loading groceries into his truck stopped when he saw the flash and realized she had collapsed. He stepped forward but froze when he noticed small sparks dancing across the puddle around the pole. Others nearby hesitated too, unsure what had happened. One shopper yelled for everyone to stay back while someone inside the store alerted employees. Within minutes, workers used cones and carts to block off the aisle, as the smell of burned plastic and faint electrical crackling filled the air. Fire department responders reached the scene at 6:31 p.m. and immediately cut power to the entire lighting circuit for the lot. Paramedics approached once the voltage was confirmed off, but Rhonda was already unresponsive. She was pronounced dead at the scene. The medical examiner later identified electrocution as the cause of death, consistent with high-voltage contact through a conductive surface in standing water. Investigators found that corrosion in an underground junction had caused a short during the storm. Tests showed the current reached over 200 volts, strong enough to stop a heartbeat instantly. The store closed the section that night for inspection. Records revealed earlier repair requests were ignored. By the next day, city crews sealed all pole bases and added warning signs while planning full rewiring. It was November 8, 2015, in Mesa, Arizona, a dry, cool afternoon that brought steady weekend traffic into the Crosswinds shopping plaza. Inside the strip mall's small pet store, the usual chatter of birds and hum of aquarium filters filled the air. Employees were busy tending to customers buying food, tanks, and small animals. At around 3:20 p.m., the store's front counter area became the scene of an argument that would end in a sudden and tragic accident. The customer was 39-year-old Sharon Malloy, an office administrator and divorced mother of one who lived a few miles away. She was a regular at the store, often stopping by for bird feed and supplies. Employees described her as outspoken, known for questioning prices and frequently asking for discounts on items she thought were overpriced. That day, Sharon came in asking about a small parakeet she'd seen on a previous visit. The bird had been part of a local rescue program that worked with the shop, and its adoption fee was listed at $25 to cover care and medical costs. According to witnesses, Sharon argued that the store shouldn't charge for rescued animals. She spoke loudly enough that nearby customers turned to look. The employee at the counter, a college student working part-time, tried explaining that the fee went to the rescue organization, not the store itself. Sharon didn't accept the explanation and kept arguing, insisting the fee was unfair. She lifted a small metal bird cage from her cart and began pointing out its flaws: bent bars, a loose latch, chipped paint along the bottom edge. Witnesses said she waved it slightly as she spoke, her movements sharp enough that the employee stepped back from the counter. The store's security footage showed Sharon setting the cage down hard on the counter, then lifting it again in frustration. Behind her, another customer quietly moved away from the register area. When she slammed the cage down a second time, its lower edge struck the electrical cord of a heat lamp that was clamped to a reptile tank nearby. The lamp jolted loose and dropped behind the counter, hitting a plastic bottle of glass cleaner stored on a lower shelf. The cleaner contained ammonia and alcohol-based solvents, common in commercial products but highly flammable. The bulb, still hot from continuous use, shattered on impact. In the same instant, the escaping vapor ignited, producing a brief but intense flash. Employees described hearing a sharp pop and seeing a burst of orange flame that spread upward from the floor to the counter. Sharon's blouse, made of lightweight polyester, caught fire almost immediately. Surveillance video later showed her stepping back in shock, waving her arms as the fabric began to melt against her skin. Two employees rushed forward. One grabbed a towel from the grooming station, while another unplugged the lamp's power cord. They managed to smother the flames within seconds, but by then Sharon had suffered severe burns to her upper torso and right arm. A customer ran outside to flag down a passing patrol car, and the officer radioed for paramedics. Emergency responders arrived within minutes and transported Sharon to a nearby burn center. She was pronounced dead later that evening due to thermal injuries and secondary complications from smoke inhalation. The fire department investigation concluded that the ignition was accidental but preventable. Inspectors noted that the lamp's power cord had been improperly routed near cleaning supplies, and the clamp securing the fixture to the tank had loosened from repeated use. Although the heat output was within normal range, contact with the flammable vapors was enough to start the flash fire. Investigators ruled the fire an accident caused by unsafe equipment placement, with no criminal charges filed. The store closed for cleanup and repairs as inspectors documented burn damage across the counter and shelving. It reopened a week later with new glass enclosures for all heat lamps, added safety guards and warning signs reminding customers to keep items clear of electrical cords. It was August 4th, 2017 in Eugene, Oregon, a Friday night when the downtown multiplex was packed for the late showing of a new superhero movie. The air smelled of popcorn and soda, and ushers moved between theaters cleaning up from earlier showings. Inside Auditorium 6, where the 10:30 p.m. screening was just beginning, 48-year-old Linda Sinclair had already taken a seat in the middle row, sipping from a large drink and scrolling through her phone. Linda worked as a retail supervisor at a clothing outlet nearby and was known to co-workers as outspoken and sometimes argumentative. According to friends, she often came to late movies alone after having drinks at a bar down the street that night. She had purchased a general admission ticket, but sat in a seat marked as reserved, part of the theater's new numbered seating system that had caused confusion and frequent disputes since being introduced a few months earlier. At 10:37 p.m., a couple entered and walked toward the center of the row where Linda was seated. Their tickets showed the same seat number she occupied, and they asked her to move. Witnesses said she refused, insisting she had arrived first. The couple went to get assistance, and two ushers returned a few minutes later, checking tickets under the dim theater lighting. When they asked her to move to her assigned seat, she declined. Security footage showed Linda standing, holding her phone, and arguing with staff while waiting for a manager. When he approached, she began recording, and nearby patrons started watching as the dispute grew louder. As the ushers stood their ground, Linda began stepping backward, trying to keep all three employees in her camera frame. The stadium-style seating had narrow, steep steps between each row, with just enough width for a single foot. Witnesses seated 2 rows below later said she moved without looking behind her. When her heel landed partly off the step, her weight shifted suddenly. Her left ankle twisted and she lost balance. In one motion, her body tipped backward into the aisle. The fall covered about 5 feet in elevation, enough to generate a strong impact. Her head struck the steel base of the aisle handrail before her phone slid down several steps, its flashlight still on. The theater went silent for several seconds before a man near the aisle called out for help. Staff immediately stopped the film and turned on the overhead lights. The ushers moved the crowd back while one checked for a pulse. A nurse who happened to be in the audience assisted until paramedics arrived roughly 7 minutes later. Linda was unresponsive and was later pronounced dead at the hospital from blunt force trauma to the back of the skull. Police reviewed the footage from both the theater cameras and audience phones. The investigation determined the fall was accidental and that staff had acted appropriately. Toxicology tests found moderate alcohol levels in her system, but no drugs. The medical examiner confirmed a fatal skull fracture consistent with impact against a fixed metal surface. The theater reopened the next day, but implemented new safety and seating protocols. Ushers were instructed to verify reserved seating before each showing to prevent disputes, and small warning signs were added to stairway entries reminding patrons to watch their step staff. Later said it was the first and only fatal accident the location had ever experienced, an argument that turned tragic within seconds. It was April 3rd, 2016, and the afternoon sun streamed through the windows of a grocery store in Baton Rouge, Louisiana, as shoppers navigated the crowded aisles during the post-work rush. The 35,000-square-foot store buzzed with the familiar sounds of shopping carts, checkout scanners, and the occasional crying child as families stocked up for the week ahead. Margaret Thompson adjusted her collection of reusable shopping bags while surveying the produce section, with the critical eye of someone who had appointed herself the store's unofficial organic food inspector. At 52, the yoga instructor had transformed healthy eating into an obsession with food purity that consumed her every waking moment. Her apartment was filled with books about toxins, pesticides, and what she called the corporate poisoning of America's food supply. Margaret's reputation preceded her at every grocery store in the greater Baton Rouge area, where employees would brace themselves when they saw her approaching with her magnifying glass and pH testing strips she believed could reveal pesticide residue, though they were really designed for water testing. She had memorized the organic certification requirements of dozens of farms and would interrogate produce managers about the origins of every fruit and vegetable. What started as a commitment to healthy eating had evolved into an elaborate conspiracy theory involving conventional farmers, grocery chains, and government agencies that she believed were deliberately poisoning the population. She had already been banned from 2 stores for harassing customers about their food choices, yet she targeted different branches of smaller markets that lacked shared security systems, slipping in unnoticed despite prior bans. That afternoon, Margaret had arrived with her testing equipment to inspect the store's produce section, determined to expose what she called the contamination of organic foods with conventional products. She had brought her pH strips, magnifying glass, and a notebook to document violations of organic standards. Margaret began her inspection process by examining organic apples with her magnifying glass, looking for signs of pesticide residue or cross-contamination from conventional produce. When she discovered conventional and organic apples displayed in adjacent bins, she launched into a loud lecture about contamination and consumer fraud, demanding that the produce manager immediately separate all organic items. The store manager politely explained that the produce was properly labeled and met all regulatory requirements. Margaret's voice rose to a shout as she accused the staff of deliberately poisoning customers. She pulled out a small canister of spray she had bought from a fringe wellness website, an alcohol-based detox mist she believed could neutralize toxins on food. Margaret began spraying the conventional produce while screaming about pesticide poisoning, claiming she was decontaminating the food for other customers' safety. The spray contained a highly flammable alcohol-based solution that she believed would neutralize chemical residues. When a store employee tried to stop her, Margaret continued spraying while pulling out her phone to document what she called corporate resistance to food safety. Several shoppers later recalled smelling sharp chemical fumes moments before the flash. As Margaret filmed herself spraying the produce and lecturing about contamination, she accidentally triggered her lighter while trying to illuminate the organic certification labels for her video. The flame ignited the alcohol-based spray she had been using liberally throughout the produce section, creating a flash fire that engulfed her immediately. Margaret Thompson suffered fatal burns from the fire she had accidentally started with her own decontamination spray. She died before paramedics could arrive, her phone still recording as the flames consumed her organic food conspiracy theories along with her life. Investigators discovered her car contained thousands of pages of printed conspiracy theories about food contamination. Strangely, Margaret's purse contained a handwritten note that read, "Today, I expose the truth with no explanation," a detail that sparked endless speculation about whether she had planned something even more extreme than her usual confrontations. It was November 18th, 2014, and the cozy atmosphere of Grind Coffee House in Portland, Oregon, filled with the familiar sounds of espresso machines, quiet conversations, and the gentle clicking of laptop keyboards. The converted warehouse space featured exposed brick walls, vintage furniture, and large windows that provided natural light for dozens of freelancers, students, and remote workers. Brenda Morrison arranged her laptop, external monitor, and graphic design materials across 2 tables near the main Wi-Fi router, creating a makeshift office that she defended with territorial instincts. At 52, the freelance graphic designer had appointed herself the unofficial monitor of public Wi-Fi usage, timing other customers with a stopwatch and confronting anyone who exceeded what she considered reasonable internet time. Her daily routine involved arriving at opening time to claim the best spot and aggressively defending her territory. Brenda's obsession with Wi-Fi policing had developed over the past year as her graphic design business struggled, and she spent increasingly long hours in coffee shops. She had created elaborate theories about bandwidth theft and internet freeloading, convinced that other customers were deliberately slowing down her connection to sabotage her work. The transformation from quiet customer to Wi-Fi vigilante had been gradual, beginning with polite suggestions about sharing internet resources and escalating to aggressive confrontations with college students and other freelancers. Brenda had been asked to leave multiple establishments for harassing customers, but she always returned the next day with renewed determination. That morning, Brenda had noticed a college student working on what appeared to be a research paper, his laptop open for over 2 hours. In Brenda's mind, this constituted bandwidth theft that was directly impacting her ability to upload large graphic design files to clients. Brenda marched over to the student's table with her stopwatch in hand, launching into a loud lecture about Wi-Fi etiquette. When the student ignored her and kept working, she escalated by attempting to disconnect the main router from the wall. The device was mounted about 8 feet up to prevent tampering, but Brenda was determined to reach it and assert her control. She dragged over an old wooden chair that had been part of the coffee shop's vintage furniture collection. The chair showed signs of wear and had a loose leg that the staff had been meaning to repair. Brenda climbed onto the unstable chair, stretching to reach the router while continuing to lecture the room about internet freeloading. Employees shouted for her to get down, but the moment passed too quickly for anyone to reach her. The old wooden chair, weakened by years of use, collapsed under her weight. She fell backward from the 8-foot height, her head striking the concrete floor with tremendous force. The impact caused severe head trauma and a fractured skull. Brenda Morrison lost consciousness immediately and died from massive brain injury before paramedics could arrive. Her fall had been witnessed by dozens of customers who called 911, but the damage from hitting the concrete floor was too severe to survive. Investigators found that Brenda had been documenting other customers' internet usage in a detailed journal, including photos and personal information, a discovery that raised questions about whether her Wi-Fi policing was masking more serious stalking behavior. It was July 22, 2017. And the scorching afternoon heat of Fresno, California, created shimmering waves above the vast asphalt parking lot of the Walmart Supercenter as hundreds of shoppers navigated the maze of cars searching for available spaces. The temperature had reached 104 degrees, making tempers run even hotter than usual. Linda Martinez sat in her air-conditioned Honda Civic, surveying the parking lot through binoculars while making detailed notes in a spiral notebook dedicated to documenting what she perceived as shopping cart violations. At 45, the bank teller had transformed shopping cart enforcement into her personal crusade, spending her weekends patrolling shopping centers and confronting customers who failed to return their carts to designated areas. Her car's console contained homemade violation notices, a digital camera, and a measuring tape for documenting cart abandonment. Linda's obsession with shopping cart justice had begun 2 years earlier when she witnessed a runaway cart scratch her car in a parking lot, leading her to study store policies and develop an encyclopedic knowledge of shopping cart etiquette. She had appointed herself a vigilante enforcer, photographing abandoned carts and lecturing shoppers about their civic responsibilities. The escalation from documenting violations to actively confronting other shoppers had been gradual, starting with polite reminders about cart return policies and evolving into aggressive confrontations. Linda carried business cards identifying herself as a shopping cart compliance volunteer and would lecture customers about the social contract of shared retail spaces. That afternoon, Linda spotted a family loading groceries into their minivan while their empty shopping cart sat unattended nearby, slowly rolling toward other parked cars in the 104-degree heat. Determined to ensure they learned proper cart etiquette, Linda marched over to confront them about their negligent behavior. When the family finished loading their groceries and prepared to leave, Linda positioned herself directly behind their cart and launched into her prepared speech about shopping cart responsibility. The frustrated parents dealing with tired children and melting frozen foods in the extreme heat tried to retrieve their cart to return it properly. Instead of allowing them to take the cart, Linda grabbed it and began pushing it back toward their vehicle while shouting about civic duty and retail courtesy. She was determined to complete her lecture about proper shopping cart etiquette, even as she backed the heavy metal cart toward the family's minivan at approximately 2 miles per hour. Linda, focused on her lecture and not watching where she was going, backed directly into the path of another shopper's SUV that was slowly reversing out of a parking space. The late afternoon glare off parked car windshields and Linda's crouched position behind the cart made her nearly invisible in the SUV's rearview mirror. The driver, checking their mirrors for pedestrians, didn't see her until it was too late. Linda was struck by the reversing vehicle and knocked to the ground, suffering massive head trauma that killed her within minutes. The driver was initially questioned, but security footage clearly showed Linda's erratic behavior and her failure to watch for traffic while pursuing her cart crusade. Her car contained over 3,000 photographs of abandoned shopping carts, evidence of an obsession that had consumed her life and ultimately caused her death. It was January 15, 2015, and the post-holiday shopping atmosphere at a large department store in Tampa, Florida, buzzed with customers returning unwanted gifts and taking advantage of clearance sales. The 120,000-square-foot store's customer service department had been overwhelmed since New Year's Day with returns, exchanges, and complaints from shoppers dealing with holiday purchases. Susan Rodriguez wheeled a shopping cart overflowing with designer clothing, shoes, and accessories toward the customer service counter, her eyes gleaming with the confidence of someone who had perfected an elaborate scam. At 41, the administrative assistant had transformed retail returns into a lucrative side business, using fraudulent receipts and stolen credit cards to return obviously used merchandise for full refunds. Her spare bedroom had been converted into a warehouse of stolen goods. Susan's return fraud operation had generated over $30,000 in illegal profits over the past 2 years, funded by an elaborate network of fake identities, stolen credit cards, and forged receipts. She maintained detailed spreadsheets tracking her fraudulent activities across dozens of retailers, rotating between stores to avoid detection while building relationships with naive employees. The evolution from occasional fraudulent return to full-scale criminal enterprise had been gradual, beginning with legitimate returns that Susan realized could be manipulated for profit. She had studied store policies and developed increasingly sophisticated methods for creating fake documentation. That afternoon, Susan had arrived with her most ambitious scam yet, a cart full of obviously worn designer clothing that she planned to return using fake receipts. The merchandise showed clear signs of use, including makeup stains, stretched fabric, and missing tags. Susan approached the customer service counter, presenting a stack of obviously fraudulent receipts for merchandise that had clearly been worn extensively. When the customer service manager examined the merchandise and noticed the clear evidence of use, Susan became increasingly aggressive. She claimed the store was discriminating against her and threatened to file complaints with corporate headquarters. The manager politely explained that the store could not accept returns for obviously used merchandise without proper documentation. Susan's response was to become violent, throwing hangers and clothing items at the employees while screaming about customer service and corporate theft. Determined to take what she considered rightfully hers, Susan climbed over the customer service counter to access the cash register directly. Her face was flushed red with rage, and her breathing had become rapid and labored from the physical exertion and extreme stress of the confrontation. Years of poor diet, smoking, and untreated hypertension had taken their toll on her cardiovascular system. As Susan reached for the cash register, while screaming at the employees, the combination of extreme rage, physical exertion, and her pre-existing heart condition triggered a massive heart attack. She clutched her chest and collapsed behind the customer service counter, her face turning blue as her heart stopped beating. Despite immediate CPR attempts by store employees and paramedics who arrived within minutes, Susan Rodriguez died from cardiac arrest on the customer service floor, surrounded by the fraudulent merchandise she had tried to return. The stress and fury of her failed scam had literally caused her heart to give out. Investigation revealed an extensive criminal network involving stolen identities and return scams, totaling over $75,000. Curiously, Susan's purse contained a lottery ticket for that evening's drawing worth $50 million, a ticket she would never get to check, leaving people to wonder if her life of crime might have ended differently if she had just waited one more day. It was September 9, 2013, and the dinner rush at a fast food restaurant in Phoenix, Arizona, created a chaotic symphony of sizzling fryers, beeping timers, and shouted orders as teenage employees struggled to keep up with the demands of hungry customers. The temperature outside had reached 108 degrees, driving people indoors and creating longer than usual lines. Deborah Walsh adjusted her phone's camera settings as she prepared to document what she planned would be another successful confrontation with minimum wage workers. At 38, the dental receptionist had transformed complaining into an art form, visiting the same fast food location daily to find fault with everything from food temperature to service speed. Her phone's photo gallery contained hundreds of images of allegedly substandard meals, which she used as evidence in her frequent demands for free food. Deborah's daily routine involved strategic visits to fast food restaurants during peak hours, when stressed employees were most likely to make mistakes she could exploit. She had memorized corporate complaint procedures for dozens of chains and could recite specific policy numbers during her confrontations with teenage workers. The transformation from occasional complainer to professional food scammer had begun when Deborah discovered that aggressive behavior and threats of social media exposure could result in free meals and gift cards. She had developed increasingly elaborate schemes for manufacturing complaints, including bringing her own cold food to claim temperature violations. That evening, Deborah had arrived during the 6 p.m. dinner rush with her phone fully charged and her complaint strategy prepared. She ordered her standard meal and immediately began her inspection process, photographing the burger from multiple angles, while loudly commenting about its allegedly improper assembly. When the teenage cashier offered to remake the burger, Deborah rejected the solution and demanded to speak with the manager immediately. She began filming the interaction while explaining to other customers that she was documenting discrimination and poor service for social media exposure. The manager, a 19-year-old college student, politely addressed Deborah's complaints and offered multiple solutions, including a refund, replacement meal, or store credit. None of these options satisfied Deborah, who had come specifically to create a confrontation. Determined to get the perfect camera angle for her complaint video, Deborah climbed onto the service counter while continuing to film and lecture the employees. She wanted to capture what she claimed were health code violations in the kitchen area, despite having no knowledge of actual food safety regulations. While gesturing dramatically for her video and berating the teenage workers, Deborah stepped backward on the narrow counter to get a wider shot. She lost her footing and fell backward off the counter, striking her head on the hard tile floor with tremendous force. The impact caused severe head trauma and a fractured skull. Deborah Walsh died from massive brain injury within minutes of her fall, her phone still recording as she lay motionless on the restaurant floor. The footage from her phone showed that she had been planning to post the confrontation on social media with the caption "Exposing the fast food corruption," a post that was never published, leaving her followers to wonder what had happened to their daily dose of complaint content. Encouraged her extremist behavior. The pediatric office was forced to close for the day, causing dozens of children to miss important vaccinations. Investigation revealed that Margaret had been planning increasingly dangerous protests, including attempts to disrupt hospital emergency rooms and medical conferences. Strangely, Margaret's phone contained a draft social media post scheduled for later that day that read, "If something happens to me, know that I died fighting for the truth," a message that suggested she may have anticipated the dangerous outcome of her protest, raising questions about whether her death was accidental or a form of martyrdom for her cause. It was September 12, 2015, and the late afternoon sun cast long shadows across the manicured lawns of Sunset Ridge, an exclusive gated community in Scottsdale, Arizona. The 4,200-square-foot clubhouse buzzed with tension as nearly 80 residents filed into the main conference room, their voices creating an anxious murmur that echoed off the vaulted ceilings. The smell of fresh coffee from the hospitality station mixed with the faint scent of desert sage that drifted through the open windows. Patricia Whitfield adjusted her reading glasses one final time as she surveyed the crowd from behind the mahogany podium, her perfectly styled blonde hair not moving despite the gentle breeze from the air conditioning. At 52, the tyrannical HOA president had spent 6 years transforming the once peaceful community into her personal kingdom of rules and regulations. Her day job as a high-end real estate agent provided the income to support her obsessive lifestyle, but controlling her neighbors had become her true calling. Patricia carried a measuring tape and digital camera everywhere, documenting violations with the precision of a crime scene investigator. Her daily patrol routes covered every inch of the community's 240 acres, and she maintained detailed files on each of the 156 households. Residents had learned to peek through their curtains before stepping outside, knowing that Patricia might be lurking nearby with her citation book. Her aggressive enforcement had pushed several families into costly disputes over fines and legal fees. The Hendersons eventually sold their home after repeated citations over minor property issues escalated into thousands of dollars in penalties. Another family left after a prolonged conflict over landscaping rules, leaving neighbors wary of Patricia's zero-tolerance approach. Patricia took immense pride in her zero-tolerance policy and frequently boasted to other HOA presidents about maintaining the highest property values in Maricopa County. She had called tonight's special meeting to discuss her latest crusade: new restrictions that would ban all outdoor holiday decorations and limit pet ownership to one small dog per household. The meeting began with Patricia's characteristic intensity as she clicked through her PowerPoint presentation, each slide detailing new violations she had discovered and the corresponding fines she planned to implement. Her voice grew more shrill as residents began questioning her authority, their frustration evident after years of living under her oppressive rule. Patricia raised her voice as she pointed to photos of Halloween displays, insisting they lowered property values. She then turned to pet owners, blaming large dogs for the constant noise. To drive her point home, she stepped onto a chair at the front of the room. The frame shifted unsteadily beneath her weight as she continued addressing the crowd. Without warning, one of the chair's legs gave way. Patricia fell backward, her head striking the stone fireplace hearth with a sharp crack that silenced the room. The impact fractured her neck instantly, and she collapsed to the floor without movement. Blood began pooling around Patricia's head as shocked residents fumbled for their phones to call 911. She lay motionless, still clutching her violation citation book, her final words having been threats about implementing $100 daily fines for Christmas decorations. The paramedics arrived within 12 minutes, but Patricia Whitfield was pronounced dead at the scene. The HOA dissolved within 6 months, as residents voted overwhelmingly to eliminate the oppressive rules Patricia had implemented. Property values actually increased once the community became known for its welcoming atmosphere rather than strict regulations. The clubhouse fireplace was removed and replaced with a memorial garden promoting community harmony, though few mourned Patricia's passing. It was March 8, 2014, and the mild evening air carried the sounds of clinking glasses and animated conversation through the historic district of Charleston, South Carolina. Giuseppe's Italian restaurant hummed with activity, as nearly 60 diners enjoyed their meals in the elegantly appointed dining room, the soft lighting from crystal chandeliers creating an intimate atmosphere. The aroma of garlic and fresh basil filled the air, mixing with the subtle scent of aged wine from the restaurant's extensive collection. Brenda Pemberton adjusted her designer reading glasses as she surveyed the menu with the calculating gaze of someone preparing for battle. At 47, the insurance claims adjuster had built a notorious reputation throughout Charleston's restaurant scene as a serial complainer who turned every dining experience into an opportunity for confrontation and compensation. Her pattern of exaggerated grievances and threats of lawsuits had made her a dreaded customer at establishments across the Southeast. Restaurant managers throughout Charleston knew Brenda by name and would often comp her meals preemptively to avoid the lengthy confrontations that could last for hours and disrupt their other customers. Her insurance background had taught her exactly which complaints would generate the fastest results and how to phrase her grievances to suggest potential liability issues that restaurant owners feared most. Brenda had developed a systematic approach to her restaurant complaints, always arriving with a mental list of potential issues she could exploit. She understood how to escalate minor service problems into major incidents that would result in free meals, cash settlements, or both. Local restaurant staff had learned to recognize her tactics, but many establishments still found it easier to appease her than to deal with the scenes she would create. Tonight's target was Giuseppe's, an upscale establishment she had been planning to visit for months. She arrived with her usual arsenal of potential complaints, having researched the restaurant's online reviews to identify service issues that other customers had mentioned. Her goal was ambitious: a full refund plus additional compensation for what she would claim was unacceptable treatment. Brenda began her usual routine immediately, loudly criticizing the bread temperature and demanding to speak with the manager before her appetizer arrived. When manager Tony Ricci politely offered to replace her meal, Brenda escalated the situation by throwing her wine glass against the wall, the crystal shattering as it struck the exposed brick. She stood on her chair to address the entire dining room, shouting accusations about the restaurant's service and demanding satisfaction for her treatment. In her dramatic performance, she gestured wildly with her arms while berating the staff and threatening legal action against the establishment. During her theatrical display, Brenda knocked over a large decorative wine barrel that had been positioned near her table as part of the restaurant's rustic Italian theme. The empty oak barrel, used purely for decoration but improperly secured to its base, tipped forward from her movement and rolled toward the wall. The barrel struck Brenda's torso and pinned her against the brick surface. The impact fractured several ribs and compressed her chest cavity, preventing her from breathing properly. Witnesses said she gasped once before collapsing to the floor. Paramedics arrived within minutes, but she was unresponsive and later pronounced dead at the scene. Emergency medical personnel arrived quickly, but were unable to revive her. The restaurant faced a wrongful death lawsuit from Brenda's family, though security footage clearly documented her aggressive behavior leading up to the accident. Other local establishments came forward with evidence of her pattern of fraudulent complaints, creating a complex legal situation. The lawsuit was ultimately unsuccessful, but Giuseppe's installed safety barriers around all decorative items and implemented staff training for handling difficult customers. Brenda's death became a cautionary tale in Charleston's restaurant community about the dangers of escalating customer service disputes. It was November 15, 2016, and the crisp autumn air carried the scent of fallen leaves across the parking lot of Maple Grove Elementary School in Minnesota. The school auditorium buzzed with tension as nearly 150 parents, teachers, and board members filled the folding chairs. their voices creating an anxious murmur that echoed off the 20-foot ceiling. The fluorescent lights cast harsh shadows across the institutional beige walls decorated with student artwork. Susan Hutchinson adjusted her stack of printed research articles as she prepared for what she considered her most important presentation yet. At 49, the pharmaceutical sales representative had become a familiar presence at every school board meeting over the past 3 years. Known for her persistence and increasingly forceful positions, she often cited medical terminology and research articles to support her arguments. Her background in pharmaceutical sales lent her authority when she spoke, though her interpretations of the studies she referenced were often incomplete. Over time, her advocacy campaigns led to several staff departures and curriculum changes, prompting concern among teachers and administrators. What began as parent involvement gradually grew into a cycle of conflict that left the school community divided. Her latest crusade involved demanding the complete removal of all technology from classrooms, claiming that Wi-Fi signals caused irreversible brain damage in developing children. She had spent weeks preparing tonight's presentation, complete with cherry-picked studies and inflammatory rhetoric designed to terrify other parents into supporting her cause. Susan's own children had become increasingly isolated as other families avoided association with her extremist views. Teachers walked on eggshells around her kids, afraid that any perceived slight would trigger another of Susan's explosive confrontations with the administration. As Susan began her impassioned speech about the dangers of wireless technology, her voice grew increasingly shrill and her gestures more erratic. She had been experiencing severe chest pains and shortness of breath for weeks, but attributed her symptoms to the school's wireless network, rather than the chronic stress of her constant outrage. She raised her voice, waving papers frantically, and insisting Wi-Fi signals were harming children. Her face had turned bright red, and sweat beaded on her forehead despite the cool evening temperature, as she continued her presentation about the alleged dangers of wireless technology. Suddenly, Susan clutched her chest with both hands, her eyes widening in terror as crushing pain radiated down her left arm. She stumbled backward from the podium, her breathing turned shallow. Between strained gasps, she repeated that the Wi-Fi was making her sick before collapsing onto the auditorium floor as board members and parents rushed to help. She suffered a massive heart attack linked to chronic hypertension and stress. Despite the quick response of paramedics, Susan Hutchinson was pronounced dead at Maple Grove Hospital at 9:23 p.m., her final words being demands that the Wi-Fi was killing her. The autopsy revealed severe coronary artery disease exacerbated by chronic stress and hypertension. Her group faded, and the board emphasized respectful debate at future meetings. The school board also established a mental health awareness program for parents struggling with education-related anxiety. It was December 23, 2017, and the holiday shopping frenzy filled the air at Pioneer Place Mall in Portland, Oregon. The Nordstrom department store buzzed with last-minute shoppers as nearly 200 customers navigated the crowded aisles, their voices creating a symphony of holiday stress and excitement. The scent of expensive perfume from the cosmetics counter mixed with the aroma of cinnamon from the nearby food court. Linda Blackwood wheeled her shopping cart toward the customer service counter with the confidence of someone who had done this many times before. At 44, the mortgage broker had developed a pattern of fraudulent returns over the past several years, purchasing items, using them extensively, then returning them with fabricated complaints and demands for compensation. Linda had become a known problem customer at multiple retailers throughout the Pacific Northwest, with store employees learning to recognize her frequent attempts to return obviously used merchandise. She had been banned from several stores but continued her schemes by shopping at different locations and using various excuses for her returns. Her cart contained clearly used items, a designer handbag with visible wear marks, shoes that had obviously been worn outdoors, and clothing with deodorant stains and missing tags. Linda had prepared an elaborate story about receiving defective merchandise as gifts, complete with fake receipts and manufactured outrage. The customer service manager, Jennifer Walsh, recognized Linda immediately from previous encounters and reports from other stores. The store had been documenting her fraudulent activities for months, building a case with security footage and coordination with other retailers. Tonight would mark the end of Linda's return scam operation. When Jennifer politely refused the return of the clearly damaged designer handbag, Linda's carefully constructed facade crumbled instantly. Her face contorted with rage as she began shouting threats and accusations, her voice carrying across the entire store. Other customers backed away as Linda's tantrum escalated into violence. She shouted accusations across the store and threatened legal action against the company. In her fury, she began grabbing merchandise from nearby displays and hurling it at the customer service counter. Linda seized a heavy crystal vase from a holiday display, raising it above her head with both hands. Linda hurled the vase toward Jennifer's head, but the manager ducked behind the counter just in time. The heavy crystal struck the wall and shattered on impact. A large fragment deflected off the surface and hit Linda on the side of the neck, severing a major artery. She pressed her hand to the wound and collapsed among the merchandise as blood pooled across the floor. Paramedics arrived within minutes, but she was pronounced dead at the scene while shocked shoppers looked on. Security footage revealed the full extent of Linda's return fraud scheme, leading to a posthumous investigation that uncovered tens of thousands of dollars in fraudulent returns. Multiple retailers provided evidence of her activities, and her family discovered significant credit card debt that highlighted the scope of her fraudulent operations. It was July 4th, 2013, and the oppressive Florida heat shimmered off the asphalt of West Shore Plaza's parking lot in Tampa. The shopping center buzzed with holiday activity, as nearly 500 cars filled the sprawling lot, their occupants seeking air-conditioned relief from the 95-degree temperature. The smell of hot asphalt mixed with exhaust fumes and the distant aroma of barbecue from a nearby restaurant. Deborah Morrison adjusted her homemade parking enforcement badge as she surveyed the parking lot with the authority of a self-appointed monitor. At 51, the bank manager had developed an obsession with parking violations at the mall, carrying printed notices and a digital camera to document what she considered improper parking. Her behavior had cost her friendships and strained her marriage, but she refused to abandon what she saw as her duty. Deborah kept records of license plates and would call police to report violations, even when no actual laws had been broken. She had confronted numerous shoppers over the past 2 years, turning minor parking disputes into major confrontations that often required security intervention. Mall management had repeatedly asked her to stop, but she insisted she was providing a public service. Her latest targets were a young family loading groceries into their SUV. The Johnsons had parked legally within the designated lines, but Deborah believed they were too close to the cart return area, violating her personal interpretation of parking regulations. Deborah positioned herself directly behind their vehicle while taking photos of their license plate, shouting about parking violations and threatening to call police. The father, Mark Johnson, tried to ignore her while securing his children in their car seats, but Deborah's harassment continued to escalate. When Mark began backing out slowly, Deborah deliberately positioned herself behind the moving vehicle, refusing to move despite his warnings. She pounded on the rear window while continuing her complaints about parking violations, her face red with rage in the sweltering heat. The SUV's rear bumper struck Deborah as she moved closer to prevent their departure. The impact knocked her backward onto the concrete, and her head struck the curb. The sound echoed across the parking lot as witnesses called for help. But Deborah Morrison died from severe brain trauma. Security footage showed Deborah's aggressive behavior and deliberate positioning behind the moving vehicle. The driver was initially charged with vehicular manslaughter, but charges were dropped when witnesses testified about her actions. The mall hired professional parking attendants and installed additional security cameras following the incident. It was August 19, 2018, and the cool mountain air carried the sounds of urban life through the courtyard of Pine Ridge Apartments in Denver, Colorado. The three-story complex housed nearly 200 residents in 80 units, their evening routines creating the normal symphony of apartment living. The scent of dinner preparations drifted from open windows, mixing with the fresh smell of recently watered landscaping. Margaret Daniels pressed her ear against the wall, separating her unit from her neighbors, her decibel meter registering the faint sound of a television at normal volume. At 46, the government clerk had developed an obsession with noise complaints, filing numerous formal grievances during her 2 years of residency. Her persistent complaints had resulted in several families moving out of the complex. Margaret documented sounds throughout the day, maintaining logs with timestamps and decibel readings. She would pound on walls and ceilings at various hours, demanding quiet from neighbors who were conducting normal daily activities. Her apartment contained multiple sound monitoring devices and stacks of complaint documentation. The upstairs neighbors, the Chen family, had endured months of Margaret's complaints about normal activities like walking across their floor and watching television at reasonable volumes. Tonight, their 8-year-old daughter was practicing piano at 7 p.m., well within the building's designated quiet hours that didn't begin until 10 p.m. Margaret became increasingly agitated as the piano music drifted through the ceiling. She grabbed her decibel meter and complaint forms, going upstairs to confront the family about what she considered excessive noise. Her pounding on their door echoed through the hallway, but the Chens had learned to ignore her complaints. Frustrated by their refusal to answer, Margaret retrieved a maintenance ladder from the storage closet and positioned it against the building's exterior wall. She planned to climb onto the Chen's second-floor balcony to continue her confrontation, bypassing their locked door. The wooden balcony railing, installed when the complex was built in 1987, had been weakened by 31 years of Colorado weather extremes. Freeze-thaw cycles had loosened the bolts, and recent heavy rains had rotted the support posts, though the damage wasn't visible from ground level. Margaret climbed the ladder with her complaint notebook tucked under her arm and her decibel meter hanging from her belt. At 5 feet 6 inches and 160 pounds, she represented a significant load for the compromised railing system. Other residents watched from their windows as she reached the balcony level, some recording the scene on their phones. Margaret pounded on the sliding glass door while the Chen family remained inside. She leaned her full weight against the railing to get closer to the window, applying pressure to the weakest section of the deteriorated structure. The railing gave way with a sharp crack that echoed through the courtyard. Margaret fell 3 stories onto the concrete courtyard below, her body striking the pavement with an impact that could be heard throughout the complex. The fall created a loud disturbance that startled neighbors who had been sleeping peacefully despite her constant complaints about normal living sounds. She died instantly from multiple fractures and massive internal injuries, her decibel meter shattered beside her body. The apartment complex faced liability issues for the unsafe balcony railing that hadn't been properly maintained or inspected. A structural engineer's report revealed that multiple balconies throughout the property had similar deterioration, leading to a renovation project. Neighbors provided evidence of Margaret's harassment campaign, documenting her behavior toward families conducting normal daily activities. The Chen family moved out within a month following the incident. New building management implemented policies requiring mediation before eviction proceedings for noise complaints. They installed soundproofing in units with shared walls and established quiet hours that balanced residents' rights to both peace and normal living activities. The complex installed safety barriers around all balconies and implemented regular structural inspections. Margaret's apartment was converted into a community room where residents could resolve disputes through mediation. It was July 15, 2016, when 34-year-old Haley Grant arrived at Maplewood Community Pool in suburban Ohio, armed with her usual arsenal of complaints and barely contained rage. As a middle manager at a local insurance company, Haley had perfected the art of making everyone around her miserable, treating colleagues like incompetent children and neighbors like personal enemies. Her recent divorce had only amplified her bitter personality. Rather than examining her own role in the marriage's failure, Haley blamed everyone else for her mounting legal fees and custody battles. She had become the neighborhood's most feared resident, filing noise complaints over children playing and threatening lawsuits against the Homeowners Association over trivial infractions like mailbox heights and grass length. The sweltering Saturday afternoon found the community pool packed with families seeking relief from the 90-degree heat. Haley immediately zeroed in on her target, a Hispanic family enjoying the water with their children. Her insurance background had taught her to scrutinize every detail, and she applied this skill to policing who belonged in her community. Marching toward the teenage lifeguard, Haley launched into her familiar routine of demands and threats. She insisted the family be removed, claiming they probably weren't even residents, and threatening to call immigration services. The young lifeguard, barely 18 and earning minimum wage for summer work, tried explaining that all pool users had shown proper identification and paid their fees. But Haley's rage was building to a dangerous crescendo. Her face flushed red as she stormed toward the pool deck, hurling racial slurs at the family while other swimmers watched in horror. Several parents began gathering their children, recognizing the signs of an impending confrontation. The pool's peaceful atmosphere transformed into tense silence as her voice echoed across the water. In her fury, Haley gestured wildly while backing toward the diving area, completely unaware of her surroundings. The wet concrete around pools becomes treacherous when combined with aggressive movement and poor judgment. Her foot slipped on the slick surface, sending her tumbling backward toward the deep end. Witnesses heard a loud crack as Haley's head struck the diving board's metal structure. She hit the water hard and didn't surface. Blood began spreading through the water around her floating body. The teenage lifeguard immediately dove in and pulled her to the pool's edge with help from other swimmers. Haley was unconscious, bleeding from her head, and not breathing. Someone called 911 while others attempted CPR. Paramedics arrived within minutes and worked on her briefly before rushing her to the hospital. She never regained consciousness and was pronounced dead later that evening. The Hispanic family she had targeted stayed to provide statements to police, expressing genuine sadness despite her treatment of them. Security footage confirmed the incident was accidental, though witnesses noted her aggressive behavior had preceded the fall. Her ex-husband declined to speak with reporters about the incident. The community pool installed additional safety features and anti-slip surfaces following the tragedy, but neighbors quietly acknowledged the ironic circumstances. Local news coverage focused primarily on pool safety measures, rather than the confrontation that led to the accident. The woman who spent years trying to exclude others from her community had ultimately excluded herself from life itself through her own reckless hatred and misplaced anger. Her two children, who had witnessed their mother's toxic behavior for years, were left to process not only her sudden death, but the shameful circumstances surrounding it. It was November 23, 2017, when 42-year-old Victoria Lawson strutted into Westfield Shopping Center in Phoenix, Arizona, with her phone already recording and her litigation mindset fully activated. As a real estate agent who had never met a lawsuit she didn't like, Victoria treated every interaction as potential evidence for her next court case. Her silver BMW in the parking lot bore the infamous "Live Laugh, Litigate" decal that had become her calling card around town. Victoria had transformed customer complaints into an art form, having been banned from 3 different Starbucks locations for screaming at teenage baristas over drink temperatures and name spellings. Her Yelp profile read like a legal threat generator, with each 1-star review promising lawsuits and demanding compensation. The Black Friday shopping frenzy provided the perfect hunting ground for Victoria's predatory behavior. She had arrived specifically to document what she called employee incompetence, armed with expired coupons and an arsenal of unreasonable demands designed to create confrontational situations. At a popular clothing store, Victoria zeroed in on her target, an 18-year-old cashier named Emma, who was working her first Black Friday shift. Victoria presented a 15% discount coupon that had expired 2 months earlier, demanding it be honored, despite the clear expiration date printed in bold letters. When Emma politely explained store policy regarding expired coupons, Victoria's face began turning red. She immediately started filming, positioning her phone to capture what she planned to frame as discrimination and illegal business practices. Her voice rose to theatrical levels as she berated the teenager about customer rights and threatened legal action. The store manager, a patient woman in her 30s, approached to defuse the situation. She calmly reiterated the expired coupon policy while offering alternative discounts available that day. But Victoria was beyond reason, her anger escalating with each passing moment. Victoria's breathing became labored as she worked herself into an extreme rage. Sweat beaded on her forehead despite the air conditioning, and her face turned an alarming shade of crimson. She began hyperventilating while screaming about corporate conspiracies and customer discrimination. Other shoppers backed away as Victoria's tirade reached dangerous intensity levels. Her hands shook as she pointed accusingly at the staff, her voice cracking from the strain of sustained yelling. Suddenly, Victoria clutched her chest and stumbled backward. She had a history of high blood pressure, which made her collapse under the extreme stress of her tirade even more dangerous. Her phone slipped from her hand as she fell, struggling to breathe and coughing sharply. Emma immediately called 911 while the manager and other customers tried to help. Victoria was conscious but clearly in severe distress, unable to speak coherently. Her breathing was shallow and irregular, and she kept clutching her chest. Paramedics arrived and worked on Victoria before transporting her to the hospital. She never regained full consciousness during transport and was pronounced dead shortly after arrival. Emma, the teenage cashier, was shaken by the incident, along with other shoppers who witnessed Victoria's collapse. Store security footage captured the entire incident, showing Victoria's extreme agitation before her collapse. The medical examiner later determined the cause of death, though the results weren't immediately released. Victoria's family declined to speak with reporters about the incident. The shopping center reviewed its customer service protocols following the tragedy, and the incident became a talking point about the dangers of extreme anger and confrontational behavior in retail environments. It was March 8, 2018, when 38-year-old Paige Turner discovered her leased BMW being loaded onto a tow truck in a downtown Seattle parking garage, and her world of legal threats was about to collide with cold mechanical reality. As a corporate lawyer specializing in what colleagues privately called frivolous lawsuits, Paige had built her career on finding fault in everything and everyone around her. Her vanity license plates, with a bold message that hinted at her confrontational nature, perfectly captured her approach to life. Paige treated parking regulations like suggestions, regularly occupying handicapped spaces while claiming she would only be a few minutes. Over 2 years, she had accumulated 47 unpaid parking tickets, each one accompanied by lengthy legal briefs challenging the citations in court. The downtown garage had become her personal battleground with authority. Despite multiple warnings and escalating fines, Paige continued parking wherever convenient, confident that her legal knowledge made her untouchable. Her BMW had been flagged for towing after reaching the threshold for unpaid violations. When Paige arrived that evening to find her car being secured to the flatbed, she immediately pulled out her phone and began recording. The tow truck operator, a weathered man in his 50s named Mike, had dealt with angry car owners before, but Paige's approach was uniquely aggressive. She positioned herself directly behind the truck to prevent it from leaving while filming what she called theft and illegal seizure. Mike tried explaining the legal towing process, but Paige was already deep into her litigation mindset, threatening lawsuits and demanding immediate release of her vehicle. Despite Mike's repeated warnings about the dangerous hydraulic equipment, Paige climbed onto the truck's flatbed, determined to reclaim what she considered her illegally seized property. The metal surface was slick from Seattle's persistent drizzle, and the truck's machinery hummed with mechanical power. As Paige moved around the flatbed while recording, she lost her footing on the slick surface. Her legs became caught in the hydraulic lift as it moved, and Mike heard her scream. The crushing force trapped her lower body between moving parts of the truck's equipment. Paige's screams echoed through the concrete garage as Mike immediately shut down the hydraulics and called 911. There was significant bleeding from her trapped legs, and she was clearly in severe distress. Mike tried to keep her conscious while waiting for emergency responders, but she was obviously going into shock from her injuries. Paramedics arrived quickly and worked to stabilize her while firefighters used specialized equipment to free her from the machinery. She was conscious but barely responsive during the extraction process. Despite rapid transport to the hospital, Paige died from her injuries. The medical examiner later determined the official cause of death. Security cameras captured portions of the incident, showing Paige's reckless behavior on the truck despite safety warnings. Mike was cleared of wrongdoing after investigators reviewed the available footage. The parking garage added safety barriers and additional warning signs around tow truck operations following the incident. Paige's death became a sobering reminder in the legal community about the dangers of letting confrontational behavior override basic safety precautions. Her colleagues privately noted the tragic irony that someone who spent her career threatening others with consequences had ultimately faced the most severe consequence of all, through her own reckless actions and disregard for clearly stated warnings. It was August 12, 2015, when 29-year-old Olivia Carter walked into Bella Vista Italian restaurant in Miami, Florida, armed with her smartphone and a carefully crafted plan to scam another free meal. As a part-time call center worker who spent most of her energy writing fake negative reviews, Olivia had turned restaurant fraud into her primary source of income. With barely 800 Instagram followers, Olivia claimed to be a food influencer deserving of complimentary meals in exchange for social media promotion. Her Yelp profile was a weapon of mass destruction, filled with one-star reviews designed to extort compensation from small businesses. She carried a small collection of foreign objects in her purse, ready to plant evidence of contamination when restaurants refused her demands. Bella Vista was experiencing its typical busy dinner rush when Olivia arrived, immediately demanding to speak with the manager about a business partnership. The restaurant owner, Maria Santos, politely explained that they didn't offer influencer discounts, but welcomed honest reviews from paying customers. Olivia's demeanor shifted instantly from fake sweetness to barely contained hostility. She ordered the most expensive seafood risotto on the menu, while muttering threats about destroying their reputation online. Her plan was simple: plant evidence, create a scene, and walk away without paying. 20 minutes later, Olivia began executing her scheme. She discreetly dropped a small piece of costume jewelry into her risotto, then began loudly complaining about finding a foreign object in her food. Other diners turned to watch as she held up the planted evidence, demanding the manager's immediate attention. Maria approached calmly, offering to replace the dish and remove it from the bill. But Olivia wanted more than compensation. She wanted a spectacle that would justify her fraudulent behavior and provide content for her social media accounts. Standing dramatically while holding her plate in front of her, Olivia announced to the entire restaurant that the food was contaminated and dangerous. She gestured wildly with the heavy ceramic plate, stepping backward to address the entire dining room. She fell backward, her head striking the hard tile floor with a sickening thud. In the process, the back of her skull took the brunt of the impact, causing severe brain trauma, while the forehead scraped against a slightly raised grout line, leaving a small but bleeding cut. The plate flew from her hands, shattering across the dining area and sending ceramic fragments skittering in all directions. Olivia was dazed, making strange gurgling sounds and unable to speak clearly. Blood pooled around her head and her hands were scratched by flying plate shards. Other diners screamed and stepped back in shock, while restaurant staff immediately called 911 and tried to provide first aid. Paramedics arrived minutes later and worked frantically to stabilize her, but the traumatic brain injury was too severe, and she died en route to the hospital. The investigation later revealed that Olivia had planted fake evidence in her food, and her history of similar scams at other establishments came to light. Security footage showed her deliberately placing the object in her meal before complaining. Maria Santos was devastated that someone had died in her restaurant, despite Olivia's fraudulent intentions. The restaurant installed better lighting and non-slip flooring in response to the accident. The incident became a cautionary tale in the hospitality industry about the unpredictable dangers that can arise when dealing with increasingly aggressive scam artists, and the importance of maintaining safe premises even during confrontational situations. It was November 24, 2017, when 45-year-old Chloe Simmons arrived at Megamart Supercenter in Dallas, Texas, at 4 in the morning, already seething with the kind of rage that had consumed her life since losing her office job 6 months earlier. Rather than examining her own poor work performance and attendance issues, Chloe had embraced conspiracy theories and blamed immigrants for stealing opportunities from what she called real Americans. Her unemployment had given her endless hours to marinate in online hate groups and patriot forums, where she posted daily rants about foreign invasion and corporate conspiracies. Chloe's social media presence was a toxic wasteland of racist memes and angry videos filmed from her cluttered apartment, attracting a small but vocal following of similarly bitter individuals. Black Friday represented the perfect storm for Chloe's twisted worldview. She saw the diverse crowd of shoppers and immigrant employees as evidence of America's decline, and she had come prepared to document what she called the systematic replacement of American workers. Her phone was already recording as she stood in line, making loud comments about foreign products and non-English conversations around her. The early morning crowd was typical for Black Friday. Families seeking deals, college students buying electronics, and working people hoping to stretch their budgets. But Chloe saw enemies everywhere, particularly focusing her hatred on the store's Sikh employee, Rajesh, who wore a traditional turban while stocking shelves near the electronics section. When the doors opened at 6 a.m., Chloe immediately began pushing through crowds while filming herself and shouting about taking back America. Other shoppers tried to avoid her increasingly aggressive behavior as she confronted employees she perceived as foreign, demanding to see their documentation and work permits. Store security was monitoring her disruptive behavior, but the Black Friday chaos made immediate intervention difficult. Her rage reached a crescendo when she approached Rajesh, screaming racist slurs while other customers intervened to defend him. The young man remained professional despite her vicious harassment. In her escalating frenzy, Chloe grabbed a shopping cart and began ramming it into a display of canned goods, screaming about foreign contamination. The impact knocked several dozen heavy cans from the upper shelves, which began falling around her. Other shoppers backed away as merchandise continued tumbling from the damaged display. Store employees rushed toward the area, shouting warnings, but Chloe was still attacking the display while filming her destructive rampage. A particularly heavy 24-pack case of steel canned tomatoes, each can weighing over a pound, toppled from the upper shelf and struck Chloe directly on the side of her head near the temple. The force of the impact sent her staggering backward, where she tripped over scattered cans and fell hard onto the concrete floor. Witnesses saw her head hit the ground with significant force. She wasn't moving, and blood was visible around her head. The falling merchandise had stopped, but Chloe remained motionless on the floor. Despite the paramedics' rapid efforts, she did not make it, and later died from her injuries. Store employees and customers slowly regained their composure, still shaken by the chaos they had witnessed. The scattered cans and broken display remained as silent reminders of the sudden violence, while emergency crews worked quickly to remove her from the scene. Security footage later confirmed what everyone had feared. Chloe had attacked the display deliberately, her actions escalating with each passing moment. Rajesh, the employee she had targeted with harassment, quietly returned to his duties, visibly affected by the ordeal, yet determined to keep working, despite the memory of the morning's terror. The store reopened later that day, but the atmosphere felt tense. Employees and customers moved cautiously, some still glancing at the electronics section where it happened. Megamart added stronger shelving and better safety measures, but the memory of the tragedy lingered. It was June 3, 2016, when 51-year-old Faith Morgan arrived at the Henderson family's house in Sunset Hills subdivision, Charlotte, North Carolina, at 7 in the morning, armed with her measuring tape and an obsessive need to control every aspect of her neighborhood. After retiring from a government clerical position 6 months earlier, Faith had transformed her newfound free time into a reign of terror over her fellow residents. Faith's retirement had unleashed something dark within her personality. Without the structure of her mundane filing job, she had appointed herself as the neighborhood's unofficial standards coordinator, patrolling the streets daily with military-like dedication. Her garage was filled with meticulously organized files containing photographs, measurements, and violation reports on nearly every house in the subdivision. Over 2 years, Faith had filed over 200 complaints with the Homeowners Association, targeting families with children, elderly residents struggling with maintenance, and anyone she deemed undesirable. Her victims included a widow whose grass grew over regulation height, and an elderly veteran whose mailbox had faded paint. The Hendersons had become Faith's primary target after their teenage son installed a basketball hoop that extended 6 inches over their property line. Despite the family's attempts to reason with her, Faith had escalated the situation through multiple HOA complaints, threatening legal action, and demanding immediate removal of the recreational equipment. On this particular morning, Faith had arrived to document what she called flagrant violations of neighborhood covenants. She carried her digital camera, measuring tape, and a notebook filled with property regulations she had memorized word for word. When no one answered her aggressive knocking at the front door, Faith decided to conduct her own property inspection. She walked around to the backyard, where an electrical contractor was working on the Hendersons' outdoor lighting system. The licensed electrician, Mike Rodriguez, was installing new fixtures and had cordoned off his work area with caution tape. Faith immediately confronted Mike about permits and code violations, demanding to see his documentation while threatening to report him for illegal work. Mike tried explaining he was properly licensed and the work was permitted, but Faith was beyond reason, her obsession with control overriding basic safety concerns. Ignoring Mike's warnings about staying away from his equipment, Faith ducked under the caution tape to photograph what she claimed was illegal installation work. She was determined to document every angle of the supposed violation, convinced she had discovered a major infraction. In her zealous pursuit of evidence, Faith stepped too close to Mike's work area while taking photos. She brushed against an exposed live wire on one of the fixtures, sending a powerful electrical shock through her body. Faith immediately collapsed, her muscles convulsing violently as she lost consciousness. Mike quickly shut off the power and called 911, while a neighbor who heard the commotion came to help. Faith was unconscious and showing agonal breathing when paramedics arrived. They worked on her extensively before transporting her to the hospital, but she never regained consciousness and died later that day from complications of electrocution. The investigation confirmed that Mike's work was properly permitted, and the equipment fault was unforeseeable. The Hendersons were devastated despite years of harassment from Faith. The neighborhood gradually became more peaceful after her death. These tragic endings show how quickly things can spiral out of control. Thanks for watching. Want to watch more? Click on your screen now.